Welcome, Tammy from Magnolia, Natasha from Farmers Branch, Kevin from Houston, Amy from Austin. So glad to have all of you join us today. Welcome, Aubrey from San Antonio. So glad you could join us. Teresa from Amarillo, Austin from Odessa. Welcome. David from Channelview ISD. Shalandra from Houston. So glad to have you all join us today. Welcome. Brittany from Waco. Welcome. So glad you could join us. Welcome, Brenda from Pleasanton. So glad you could join us. All right, I have 12:15, so we're going to go ahead and get started. We've got a lot of information, so we want to give you as much time as possible to take in that information. So again, welcome. Thank you for joining us for our webinar today on the review of special education issues before the 88th Texas Legislature. We're so glad you could be here. My name is Stephanie McLaughlin, and I'm the Training and Evaluation Specialist for Partners Resource Network. Partners Resource Network is the nonprofit agency that operates the Texas statewide network of Parent Training and Information Centers, or PTIs. PTIs are funded through the Department of Education, Office of Special Education Programs. The 4 PTI projects throughout Texas are known as PACT, PACT and TEAM. And our mission here at Partners Resource Network is to empower and support Texas families and individuals impacted by disabilities or special healthcare needs. Also joining me today from Partners Resource Network is our Director of Statewide Services, Christina Henning, our support specialist, Chelsea Rivas, and our technology specialist, Zach Hidalgo. If you're having any technical difficulties today, please be sure and reach out to Zach in the chat box, and he will help you with those. For those of you that are needing a certificate of attendance, you will be receiving an email to thank you for attending today's webinar. If you'll follow the link in the email, you can get your certificate of attendance. We will be having a question and answer time at the end of the presentation. So if you're joining us on Zoom today, please type your questions in the Q&A box. If you're joining us on Facebook today, you can type your questions in the comments and we'll be sure and get those as well. We are recording today's webinar, and the recording will be available on our website at prntexas.org and on our Facebook page. So welcome again. Let me stop sharing and introduce our speaker, and then we'll get started. So welcome. Today's guest speaker is Stephen Aleman from Disability Rights Texas. Prior to joining Disability Rights Texas, Stephen had many years of experience in policy analysis, law, mediation, and teaching. He has worked both in Washington, D.C. at the federal level and in Austin at the state level. Drawing on his broad range of experience encompassing education policy analysis and disability law, Stephen now serves as a senior policy specialist at Disability Rights Texas, managing policy advocacy affecting children, youth, and adults with disability in the Texas public school system. Stephen, it's always a pleasure to have you join us, and welcome today. Let me get your PowerPoint up and we'll turn it over to you.
Well, thank you for having me once again, partner with Partners Resource Network. It's always a pleasure to join you all. And I know we have a very diverse audience with probably lots of background and interest in today's topics. So we will get right to it. If we can advance the slide. I'm going to try to do 4 things today in the time that we do have together. I'm going to just start with a general overview of the Texas legislative session that just concluded. Then, of course, the main attraction will get into a summary of legislation that affects special education and students with disabilities. I'll wrap up with just talking a little bit about next steps now that the regular session has concluded. And as mentioned by Stephanie, we'll get into as many questions that you may have as time permits. So with that, we'll advance to the next slide. And again, as a reminder, as we go through this presentation, go to the Q&A box for any questions. that come up, and we'll get to all of those at the end of the session. But again, to begin with some context, the regular session runs from the beginning of the year until Memorial Day. And it was very typical in its pattern and rhythm. Usually the session starts off very, very slowly, but then picks up speed, of course, once hearings are initiated in the springtime, and then concludes with marathon floor sessions, trying to pass as many bills as possible. Overall, state lawmakers introduced over 8,000 substantive bills. I'm not including in that list resolutions and other types of items that are filed, but actual bills to change the law in one form or another. There was over 8,000 ideas put forward by state lawmakers. Of those, just over 1,200 did pass. Not every bill is going to even get a hearing, let alone make it to the finish line. And I could spend almost this whole webinar just talking about what did not pass connected to special ed and students with disabilities. But again, in the interest of time and, obviously moving forward, we are just going to focus on what did pass of those 1,200 bills that affect special education. And just one little note as well, that the governor has already had his veto pen out. To date, only 2 bills have been vetoed from the regular session. So that is always a possibility that even though the legislature has spoken, the governor might want to speak as well. And so one important caveat as we get into all of the presentation substance is that until we get past the veto timeline period, some of these bills have not yet been signed, and so they are subject to potentially being vetoed by the governor. Next slide, please. I also want to note that in addition to the veto pen also being out by the governor, that he's actually already acted to call a special session. As you may know, again, our regular session just runs from January until Memorial Day. But then after that, what the legislature does in terms of convening to consider more legislation is up to the governor. In Texas, not only does the governor call special sessions, but also dictates what lawmakers may act upon. And the governor has already done that. You may have seen in the news, a lot of news about school district property taxes. And that is one of the 2 items on the current special session call. That is to deal with school district property taxes. And so that special session began literally the day after the regular session. It can last no longer than 30 days at a time. And so at this point, as you may also know from the news, there's an impasse between the governor, the lieutenant governor, and the speaker of the House about what to do about school district property taxes. This first special session is likely to lead to another special session, and we'll talk more about that at the end of the presentation in terms of next steps. But to advance to the next slide for now, a little bit more introduction. I just want to point out that in the Senate Education Committee was reorganized for this legislative session, including a new chair. Senator Creighton took over the leadership of that committee, as well as several new committee members. But in the end, they held 21 public hearings and business meetings over the course of the regular session. Next slide. Likewise, in the Texas House of Representatives, we had a new chair of the House Public Education Committee, Representative Buckley, and likewise, his committee also saw a lot of turnover, a lot of new members added, and they were almost as busy as the Senate committee. They ended up holding 18 public hearings and business meetings during the regular session. Next slide, please. As just a conclusion to this very, very quick introduction, because I know we want to get to the bills of interest to everyone, I do want to point out a resource to you, and that is the official legislative website called Texas Legislature Online. or TLO for short. And you'll find a link to that website in the chat. And that is a great resource for any number of reasons. You can see the legislation we're about to discuss in detail, of course. You can take a look back at all those committee meetings that I just referenced to see what exactly happened on those meetings, who showed up to speak. Most of those hearings and meetings are recorded, so you can also find the actual videotape of those meetings, as well as a host of other information about the legislature. It's a great website if you've never visited it, and it again is a great spot to go to following this webinar, just to see a little bit more of the detail of the bills we're about to get into. So with that, let's go ahead and advance to the next slide. So I want to start with the big picture about public education in Texas and what did the legislature do? Again, you may have heard in the news that there were a lot of bills that failed, with respect to public education, whether it was Texas teacher pay raises or school vouchers. There were a lot of proposals that did go down the drain, including many that connected to special education. But big picture, some other important legislation did pass, some of which have components affecting special education, which I'll get to in detail as we move forward. But I want to highlight just a couple of those big areas first. And of course, one of the big topics coming into the regular session is school safety. And of course, that was all prompted because of the tragedy at Robb Elementary School just over a year ago. The legislature formed special committees last year to study school safety. There were lots and lots of recommendations, lots and lots of bills connected to school safety, but in the end, it really came down to two key pieces of legislation passing, and that's House Bill 3 and Senate Bill 838. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about House Bill 3 in a bit, but big picture, if you want to know what is being done to make schools, quote, safer, those are the two pieces of legislation you need to review. Another big topic at the legislature, which also has a little bit to do with students with disabilities, was about accelerated instruction. And that ended up being House Bill 1416. And if you're not familiar with accelerated instruction, it's essentially remedial services for students who do not do well on the STAR assessment. And schools have always had some responsibilities for accelerated instruction. Those responsibilities were significantly changed last legislative session coming out of the pandemic. And obviously there was a lot of learning loss connected to the pandemic. And so accelerated instruction was seen as one key vehicle to help students who were hurt by the pandemic academically. There were, however, a lot of complaints about that process. And so accelerated instruction reform was reformed again through House Bill 1416. Always a big issue at the legislature is STAR, our State of Texas Assessment of Academic Readiness. And the big bill that came out of this session, regular session, connected to STAR is House Bill 1225. And this has to do with paper administration of the STAR at parental request. Now, there are some parameters around that, but in general, parents who feel it's better for their students to take the STAR on paper in sort of old-fashioned way, rather than online in front of a screen, can now ask for that to happen. That is a paper administration. Now, again, there are parameters around that, but in general, the legislature wanted to give this paper option to parents as a statutory right. And so was another big topic at the legislature affecting all students. Let me just talk about two other kind of big topics where a lot of energy was placed connected to public education. And one of those was about instructional materials and lesson plans. And that ended up in the form of House Bill 1605. And we could actually take this whole webinar just to talk about that bill alone. It's a very big piece of legislation, and I'll confess I'm not still familiar with all the nuances in it, but it's really about, as the name here label suggests, it's really about parental access to lesson plans, helping teachers in theory come up with lesson plans in a more efficient, effective manner, and about the availability of instructional materials in public schools. And of course, you can't talk about a legislative session without talking about the one thing that they actually have to do constitutionally, and that is pass a state budget. And so I don't want to leave out the fact that the state budget, in addition to obviously providing money for any number of activities and state functions, is a policy document in itself in the way that the legislature directs the spending of money. And we're going to come back to that at the very end and talk about House Bill 1 and Senate Bill 30 and some of the specific provisions about public education spending connected to students with disabilities. So let's go ahead and go to the next slide, and we are going to go ahead and move from the big picture right into the legislation connected to students with disabilities. And the bill I want to start with is House Bill 3928. This is a bill connected to dyslexia and students with disabilities who are suspected of having dyslexia or related disorders. It does a couple of things. Probably one of the more significant things in the bill is a mandate to our State Board of Education. Now, to back up for just a moment, for those of you who are not familiar with dyslexia policy in Texas schools, there is sort of a unique role that the State Board of Education plays in addition to the Texas Education Agency, our State Department of Education. The State Board of Education publishes a policy guide called the Dyslexia Handbook. And as the name suggests, it is about how students with dyslexia and related disorders should be served in public schools. The legislature has passed a mandate to the State Board of Ed, which is, of course, its own independent body in Texas, made up of officials elected from across the state. It is a mandate to the board membership to make changes to the Dyslexia Handbook. And it's a very specific directive about changing what's referred to in the handbook as standard protocol. Standard protocol is a term of art used in the Dyslexia Handbook that tries to distinguish interventions for students with dyslexia that are not individualized versus more individualized, specially designed instruction to meet the needs of students with dyslexia. The State Board of Education is being told in your dyslexia manual, you need to clarify and straighten out the description and explanation of interventions for students with dyslexia and essentially get rid of a reference to standard protocol dyslexia instruction. And so how that will play out, we're not exactly sure, but that will be in the realm of the State Board of Education going forward. Another key thing in the legislation is that it clarifies that under the special education eligibility category of specific learning disability, that a student with dyslexia may qualify under that eligibility category for special education. Next slide, please. The bill also specifically addresses the special ed process and makes some fine tuning of it. And one of the aspects of that fine tuning is a new, to yet be seen, model form developed by the Texas Education Agency that schools will provide to parents of students suspected of dyslexia and being evaluated for dyslexia so that they understand all of their legal rights with respect to their child with dyslexia. Another aspect of the legislation is specific to that special education evaluation process in making sure that essentially there's an expert on dyslexia and on that evaluation team, and that they are front and center in helping to determine what impairment the child has if dyslexia or a related disorder is suspected. And finally, the bill requires that those who are going to end up serving a student with dyslexia be appropriately trained and have the right credentials to be the best person in place to deliver dyslexia interventions to that student. Next slide, please. Finally, the bill makes a few other changes with respect to dyslexia, and then has some final kind of more general provisions I'll get to. And one other key provision, and this goes to the Board of Trustees or the Board of Directors of charter schools and our school district leadership. They now have to adopt a specific policy that is specific to students with dyslexia to ensure that they're in conformity with all state and federal guidelines and requirements about meeting the needs of students with dyslexia. And then finally, with respect to the Texas Education Agency, again, our State Department of Education, or TEA, they're going to need to adjust their monitoring practices to make sure that when they are checking on school districts, they have a specific aspect of that process that seeks parental feedback about whether students with dyslexia are having their needs met. Next slide, please. Now, the final two aspects of the bill I want to highlight, and again, these are all highlights. In the interest of time, of course, all of these bills will be just summarized, which is why I pointed you earlier to TLO to really see the details of the legislation. But the last two pieces of HB 3928 I want to point out are with respect to students who are assigned to disciplinary alternative education programs, or what we often refer to as DAEPs. And that is really affecting information to the child's parent, both when they're being assigned to a DAP and when they're leaving the DAP. And essentially, this really comes down to providing the parents more information about their option, although schools have their own obligation, of course, to suspect that a child might have a disability and needs special ed and needs to be evaluated. But parents will be informed of their right to request a special ed evaluation and how they would go about doing that. So again, this is with respect to students involved with DAEP placements, both when they're being sent to a DAEP and when they're coming out of a DAEP. So this bill takes effect this coming school year. So just in a couple of months, these practices around students with dyslexia will need to be addressed. The State Board of Education aspect of this is on a slightly different timeline, but we would hope, of course, that the SBOE act as soon as possible. Next slide, please. And again, I want to emphasize as we go through all of these pieces of legislation that obviously in the time that we have available, I'm only providing high-level highlights. And also, I am just providing and covering a select list of legislation. There's any number of bills I could have included in this presentation, but at some point I had to sort of draw a line about what's the most relevant, most important for students with dyslexia and special ed. And so again, feel free to take a look at TLO to see and search for other bills that you might think would be of interest or you've heard about. But the next bill I'm going to focus on is Senate Bill 133. It is not specific to students with dyslexia, but I do include it here because I believe that students with dyslexia will be part of the population that this will be important for. And so Senate Bill 133 really addresses law enforcement and school security personnel in elementary schools and what force and what restraint procedures they may use on an elementary school student. Specifically, the legislation talks about students who are enrolled in grade 5 and below. And it also talks about not just at school, but on school property and at school-sponsored and school-related activities. But the bottom line is that it addresses law enforcement and school security personnel and tells them that you cannot do certain things. And the things that you cannot do to a 5th grader and a child in a grade level below, is use a taser, use chemical sprays, use a handcuff, and use physical force in restraining the student. Now, I have to point out that there's a very important exception, which is going to be critical in the implementation of Senate Bill 133, and that there is an important exception that if the student poses a serious risk of harm to himself or another person, then the law enforcement or security personnel in their discretion may take advantage of or use any of these items or techniques that are otherwise prohibited. So that is a very important clarification to make about Senate Bill 133. But next slide, it goes into effect this coming school year. And we'll go on to the next slide. The next bill I want to talk about, again, is not specific to students with disabilities, but because we know that students with disabilities are disproportionately affected by threat assessment, I want to highlight it, and that is House Bill 473. And this is a process which is not new in schools. It was created last legislative session in Senate Bill 11, but as you may know, schools are required to have a threat assessment process that is done through a team that is in law outlined as to who are the members of that team. Now, what House Bill 473 is doing is bringing in the parent as a formal participant in that process in several different ways. One is that the school has to tell the parents that a threat assessment is being conducted on their child. Another is that another key part of this bill is that the school is limited in initiating that threat assessment process until they tell the parent. Third, parents will have a right now to participate in the threat assessment. Now, what does participate mean? The legislation does not say, but at the very least, it does say that participation includes the allowance of the parent to submit information about their child to the threat assessment team. So, for example, if there had been some recent family trauma of some sort, emotional trauma, physical trauma that is affecting maybe the behavior of a child, the parent is allowed to share that and must be allowed to share that with the team so that they can take that into account of whether this child is posing a threat to school safety. Next slide. And finally, whatever the threat assessment team comes up with in terms of findings and conclusions about that child, they have to now officially tell the parent and share those findings and conclusions with the parent. So the parent is in the full loop now from being told a threat assessment is being done, that you can, quote, participate, and we're going to tell you at the end of the process what we have decided. So again, not specific to special ed per se, but probably a pretty important bill for a lot of students with disabilities. Again, that's House Bill 473, and that it takes effect again this coming school year. Next slide, please. Next, I want to talk about in return to a bill I just mentioned a moment ago, and that is House Bill 3, the big school safety bill. Now, you probably have heard that the big feature of this bill is that every school has to have an armed guard. Now, that is every campus in Texas, every charter school campus, every school district campus. Now, the law gives a lot of leeway to board of trustees and board of directors of charter schools about how to fulfill that. And to some extent, this may mean nothing different this coming fall, because your school district already has its own school district police department, and they already have officers at your school during the school day. So in effect, that's nothing at all, no change in practice. But for a lot of other communities and perhaps for a lot of other campuses, this will be something different. And so again, I highlight this piece of the legislation because there's potentially implications for students with disabilities particularly those who might have a behavioral component to their disability, where we would want to make sure that that armed security officer or that SRO, school resource officer, has some information about my child and there's no misunderstanding about behaviors, for example. Next slide, please. Now, I do want to point out one important part of House Bill 3 with regard to the armed security officers, and that is that unless they are a real police officer, that it means that they are a commissioned peace officer in Texas, that they are not allowed to perform law enforcement duties. Now, there is, again, a very important exception here, that if there is a, quote, emergency that poses a threat of death or serious bodily injury to a person, then a school guard who's armed may, for instance, make efforts to subdue that individual and restrain that individual. But in general, they're not, if you're not a cop, a real police officer, you're not supposed to be acting like a law enforcement officer. You're just there to protect the premises, keep the perimeter of the school secure, and only act in an emergency. Next slide. Now, the bill also has a lot of other provisions, which I think are important, connected to students with disabilities, some very specific, which I'll talk about here in a moment. One of the key things, though, that I think is going to be of interest is that there's a new policy for transfer students that's written into the school security bill, House Bill 3. And it says that whenever a student moves to another district or a charter school, then this last school district needs to send records. That's standard. But what's new is that now part of those records are the student's disciplinary record and any threat assessment report that was completed when the student was at the old school district or old charter school. So this is going to be important about what kinds of information is floating around about a student, particularly maybe a student with a disability who unfortunately has a lot of disciplinary responses to their behavior. That information is now going to be sent as part of the records package to the new school district. Another important part of this is that schools are now going to have to hold on to student records with respect to threat assessments for a longer period of time, well beyond when a student typically would even graduate from high school. The law says now that you have to, the school district that is, has to keep threat assessment records until the student's 24th birthday. And I presume the notion behind that is if we need to go back and do some sort of investigation on a young person who's done something violent, we can see what the school district had on that student and access that records through the school district because they've been told to retain those materials. Another aspect of this bill, which I think is very important, is that, and it's not necessarily new, because a lot of school districts do this, but every school district and charter school is now going to have a process for classmates to report one another regarding concerning behavior. And I think that this could be obviously very significant for students with disabilities. And so I want to highlight this provision. Now, how this gets played out is going to be a local determination in conformity with guidelines from TEA to come. But it is, I think, a piece of House Bill 3 worth mentioning here. Now, let's go ahead and move to the next slide. There are a couple of other things in here I want to get to very quickly. One is with regard to mental health first aid training that is going to be, again, it in and of itself is not new, but more employees will be required to take this mental health first aid training. Another aspect of the bill, which is much more long-term, is with regard to the accessibility of school buildings. There is a Texas law called the Texas Elimination of Architectural Barriers Act. It's essentially the Americans with Disabilities Act in state law. And it talks about standards to make sure that all public facilities, including school districts and charter schools, are accessible. And now the Texas School Safety Center is being charged with making sure that as TEA and the School Safety Center come up with recommendations for school security that is school hardening, that we don't forget that we have to make sure that these buildings are also accessible for people with disabilities. The last point I'm making on this slide is that with regard to our education service centers, which there are 20 across the state, that if they want to, this is not a requirement, but if that service center wants to be a direct provider of positive behavioral intervention and support services, what we call PBIS in special education, that they may engage in providing that service to students on behalf of a school district. And this would be kind of a supplement to what a school district might be doing for a student who needs PBIS that might be, for instance, identified in a behavioral intervention plan or BIP. And next slide, please. A couple of other things I'm just highlighting now at the TEA level in House Bill 3. One is that some new guidance that's going to be required. Every school district and charter school now has to have what is called a multi-hazard emergency operation plan. A multi-hazard emergency operation plan is not new. It is an existing requirement, and it has to, as the name suggests, address all kinds of contingencies where there might be an emergency at a school building that threatens the well-being of everyone in the building. And that could be a man-made event, such as a school shooting. It could be an accident like a big train derailment nearby. It could be a natural disaster like a tornado. Well, now TEA is being charged with making sure that that multi-hazard emergency operation plan has some details in it with respect to the safety and security of staff and students who have disabilities. As you can imagine, what happens if we have a student who's blind? How are we going to make sure that he or she can evacuate from a building, or has a mobility impairment, or maybe has autism and is used to routines, and now all of a sudden there's some sort of emergency happening and we have to evacuate? Some best practices are out there. TEA is being charged with sort of developing those best practices into some guidelines for schools to follow, to make sure that their multi-hazard emergency operation plan does not forget about the safety and well-being of students and staff with disabilities. And finally, with respect to House Bill 3, there is a provision that TEA needs to do better monitoring of school safety and security and have its own Office of School Safety and Security. Okay, next slide. And again, I do know that I'm kind of presenting at a somewhat fast pace because we have limited time. And again, this is just an introductory summary presentation to what happened at the Capitol. One other bill I want to get to is House Bill 1926. This pertains to an existing program called the Supplemental Special Education Services Program that provides grant money to families that are eligible to participate, who get into the program, that they are allowed to use those dollars, draw down those dollars to purchase supplemental educational items and services for their child at home after school. The SSES program was created as something kind of as a response to the pandemic to help parents help their children with learning loss at home. Well, now this program is going to be continued indefinitely. The sunset on the program has been removed by House Bill 1926. Next slide, please. I want to highlight House Bill 1416 in terms of accelerated instruction. I mentioned that earlier. There's just a couple of provisions in here that I want to get to specific to students with disabilities. And one is about the role of the Admission Review and Dismissal, or ARD committee, with respect to accelerated instruction. The law used to tell ARD committees you have to meet if a student with a disability is needing accelerated instruction. Now the law says that unless someone wants to meet, you can wait until the next annual ARD to talk about accelerated instruction. Also, the bill is very clear now that students who are on the STAR Alt 2, that is the alternative to the regular STAR for students who have severe disabilities, that they don't have to go through accelerated instruction if they fail to pass the STAR Alt 2. Next slide, please. I'm just going to wrap up even more quickly with a couple of other bills and get to the state budget, and then turn the page to the last portion of our program to try to leave about 10 minutes for questions. This bill, Senate Bill 55, has to do with higher education, but I'm including it because there is a public ed component and may be important for students in terms of transition age students with autism. This is a requirement that the Higher Education Coordinating Board, which oversees Texas institutions of higher education, initiate a study and eventually create a report about best practices for students with autism. And as part of developing those best practices, they need to study what is happening in public schools to meet the needs of students with autism. So there may be some side highlights drawn out of this legislation that will help public education as well as higher education with respect to students with autism. Next slide, please. Another bill that's somewhat related to transition planning for older students is going to be a new resource coming online. House Bill 2920 creates a way of making more information available about the effectiveness, if you will, of different types of programs, whether they're certificate programs, credential programs, regular degree programs at institutions of higher education around the state, and making that information more accessible to evaluate, is this a good investment of my time and resources to go into this higher ed program. So this could be of value to transition components of an ARD committee meeting when we talk about options for students with disabilities going on to higher education. As you may know, we already have our own state components of transition planning, including a look forward for post-secondary education. And so this now may play into making sure that both parents and the student, him or herself, most importantly, are aware of what kinds of programs are out there and how they're doing and serving their current students. The next slide, please. I'm going to try to conclude here in a few more minutes and talk about the state budget and money with respect to our existing budget cycle, which is our current biennium, and the next biennium, which is the 2024-25 biennium. Going forward, this upcoming biennium cycle, it's interesting to look at all the details in the budget. But one thing that caught my eye is about how the state is expecting the number of students with disabilities to continue to grow in Texas public education. And they are setting a baseline of 3% growth in special ed over the next couple of school years. So more students with disabilities is going to mean a need for more public spending on special education in theory. Of course, appropriations have to match what the formulas generate to allocate to school districts. But at a starting point, it's interesting to see that the budget is including growth for the special ed population, which should in theory drive more special education funding. The budget includes a lot of what we call budget riders. Budget riders are very specific provisions about how to spend money as a directive to the state agency responsible for that part of the budget. And I'm just going to highlight here a couple of budget riders. There are many about special education, but there were two new ones in this year's budget, House Bill 1, that I wanted to point out. One has to do with the SSES program, the Supplemental Special Ed Services Program, and how that program is supposed to be spending money. That's Rider 73. There's also a new Rider 83, which has to do with adaptive equipment for children with multiple disabilities. This is a very unique rider because it identifies a specific nonprofit entity that is the preferred provider of these services. And what is also interesting is that at least in the initial funding cycle here, it only limits the availability of this new adaptive equipment and services program to Dallas and Houston. Finally, I wanted to highlight Rider 49, again, connected to our older student population, transition age population. It includes a directive to the Texas Workforce Commission, separate from TEA, to compile an inventory of internships and apprenticeships for people with disabilities. And so this, again, could be an important resource during the transition component of our meetings for our transition age students. Let me go ahead now and turn to the other state budget bill that was passed. That is Senate Bill 30. Now, every legislative session, there are two budget bills. One deals with the budget cycle that we are in currently, and the next one deals with the upcoming budget cycle, the next biennium, the next 2-year period. House Bill 1 deals with the budget to start this coming fall. Senate Bill 30 deals with the budget year that we are in currently. And it includes a couple of things connected to students with disabilities. One is some contingency funding. Now, I believe that we probably are all familiar that Texas has been in trouble with the federal government when it comes to serving the needs of students with disabilities. We are technically still under a corrective action plan because of findings of non-compliance by the U.S. Department of Education over the Texas Education Agency. That is still ongoing. Separately, in a separate investigation, the Department of Education found that in some past school years, the state of Texas was underfunding special education with state appropriations, what we just talked about. So the Department of Education has determined that Texas needs to be penalized, but this is in a way a very unfortunate penalty because the penalty is taking away federal dollars for special education from Texas. Now, what Senate Bill 30 says is that, okay, well, federal government, you're going to withhold some federal dollars from us. We are going to backfill that withholding with state money so that we are in the end being held harmless, or more importantly, school districts and students with disabilities are being held harmless. So Senate Bill 30 is super important because the last thing we want to have happen is the Department of Education holding Texas accountable for meeting IDEA requirements. But in the end, those who really suffer are teachers and students who need the resources to get special education services. So Senate Bill 30 says, federal government, when and if you hold that check back from us for IDEA grant money, we're ready to keep that funding stream going to school districts with state money, as it should, because this was really a state problem in the first place. Separately, in Senate Bill 30 is some extra money for the Texas School for the Blind and Visually Impaired and the Texas School for the Deaf to supplement their budgets for some specific projects that are identified in Senate Bill 30. So I don't want to forget about those important institutions that are part of the special ed community in Texas. That is a very quick run through of legislation passed during the regular session of the 88th legislature affecting students with disabilities. Again, I want to emphasize that this was a select list. and a very high-level summary of that select list. But at least it gives you a flavor of some of the more important bills, in my humble opinion, that are going to affect special education and students with disabilities in the coming school years. Now, let's turn to the last few slides I have, and then we'll open it up for questions. And I think we're going to leave about 10 minutes for questions. Of course, now that the regular session is ended on Memorial Day, what's next? Well, I want to go back to a point I made at the beginning that technically the regular session and all these bills are somewhat subject to veto. And the governor actually has just a few more days left until the end of this week, until Sunday night, the 18th, to veto legislation. So things that have not yet been signed, even though I'm going to presume they will make it through that final hurdle. I do want to point out this important caveat that there is a possibility of vetoes of some of these bills. The next thing, of course, that's most important at the bottom is the State Board of Education taking action as mandated in the dyslexia bill to update the dyslexia handbook, and that will cause some further dominoes to fall with respect to state rules and school district practices. But that's going to be on its own time schedule at the State Board of Education. Otherwise, next steps, if we can go to the next slide, please. The governor, of course, may call other special sessions beyond the current one that we're in and the impasse about school district property taxes. I alluded to this earlier, but there was a lot of time spent on education savings accounts, both specific for students with disabilities and for all students. It's anticipated that the governor will call another special session later this year at some point to return to the topic of education savings accounts, and students with disabilities will probably be part of that conversation, whether there should just be a program for them alone or how do they participate in a bigger program. And then, of course, long-term, big picture, the legislature never really goes home completely. Lawmakers will be returning next year to do what we call interim hearings to prepare for the next legislature, the 89th legislature. They will likely hold public hearings, take public testimony, but they will be limited to topics picked by the Speaker of the House and the Lieutenant Governor in the House and Senate, respectively. So if there were topics that you felt, you know what, the legislature just did not pass this important bill to me, one way to make sure it gets on the radar and on the agenda next legislative session is to pay attention to those interim hearings and make sure that you raise your voice at that time, so that those topics aren't forgotten. So we're going to come to questions next, but I want to go, if you could advance 2 more slides, please, Stephanie. I want to point out just a couple of resources here. And in particular, I want to go to the very last item on this list. And I want to point out that the Texas Education Agency does do its own legislative report. So if you're ever looking for a general summary of bills, whether they're connected to special education or not, the legislative summary report by TEA is a great resource to know about and check. Now, here's the only thing about that. Because it has to cover every public education bill, it typically takes them some time to produce it. So you're not going to find it today, and you're not going to find it next week either. But at some point later this year, the legislative report by TEA is a great resource that I use and would point out to you eventually as another resource to check back about what happened in the 88th legislature. Now, with that, if we can go back to the preceding slide, or however you want to do this, Stephanie, we will take some questions from our attendees. And I'll defer to you, Stephanie, about moderating that and throwing some questions my way.
All right, thank you. Again, if you're joining us on Zoom, please put your questions in the Q&A box so we can catch those. And if you're joining us on Facebook, you can put them in the comments. So the first question is in reference, we've got a couple of them in reference to the House Bill 3928. So the first one is, does a related disorder include dysgraphia as well?
Yes. Dysgraphia would be considered a related disorder, I believe.
All right. And then, oh, I think that was the only one. Another question, do you think teacher pay raise bill will come back in special session?
That's a great question. I would hope so. Now, what happened, just to get into a little bit more about what happened with regard to teacher pay raises, it was clear that there was support for teacher pay raises, but it got entangled in the debate over education savings accounts. And it ultimately died because of that controversy. Now, in order for there to be a teacher pay raise bill at this juncture, the governor would have to put that on the call. That is in the proclamation calling lawmakers back for a special session. So that it all just comes down to that. Does the governor want a teacher pay raise bill? And if so, then it would be charged to the legislature to come up with some details around that.
Perfect, thank you. All right, next question is on Senate Bill 133. And they ask, can you define serious? And how do we know if the student poses a serious harm?
That's a great question, a very fair question. So again, Senate Bill 133 deals with law enforcement and school security personnel and what they can and cannot do physically towards a fifth grader and a student in a lower grade level. The bill makes a change to a part of the law that already says that the Commissioner of Education, as the chief of the Texas Education Agency, has to make regulations about all of these various things, about school restraint, school seclusion, time out. And so what's curious about Senate Bill 133, or perhaps good, is that they added this prohibition and exception into that litany of items that the commissioner needs to do regulations on. So the short answer is that I would think that TEA will need to go back to the existing rules and make a proposal to amend those regulations to reflect Senate Bill 133. And when it does that, address these questions about, well, what is the meaning of serious risk of harm? What is the meaning of, if there's any question whatsoever, of a harm to self, for instance, or harm to another person? So short answer is that all of these bills leave some ambiguity of interpretation. And it's incumbent upon either the State Board of Education or mostly the TEA to come up with rules and guidelines for districts and charter schools. But the thing about 133 is that it is specifically the technical amendments were made in a part of the bill that already says the commissioner has to have rules. So we will be watching for that to happen.
Excellent. And we've got a number of questions about House Bill 3 and or House Bill 473. So one parent asks, can a parent refuse the threat assessment for their child?
Great question. Okay, so just to be clear, House Bill 473 deals with the threat assessment process and parental participation. It does not, I want to be very clear, it allows a parent to participate in the process. It does not give parents a veto right. Parents will not be asked, is it okay if we do a threat assessment? What has to happen is the school needs to tell a parent, we are doing a threat assessment. It's the school district's decision, and it will remain that way.
All right, thank you. And then another question along those same lines. What types of decisions are made if it is determined that the child is a threat? And will that include the juvenile justice system?
Okay, that's a great question. So again, about threat assessments in general, this is already a part of state law. Sadly, just like the Robb Elementary tragedy prompted House Bill 3, the Santa Fe High School shooting several years ago prompted Senate Bill 11, which created in state law the threat assessment process. And the threat assessment process talks about both who does the threat assessment team, as it's defined in the statute, and also what are some of the possible outcomes. So again, it's key to remember that threat assessment is a school process, but it does implicate law enforcement. And so if a threat assessment team makes a referral to law enforcement, then whether a student is arrested, referred to the district attorney's office, obviously depending upon their age and the nature of what is determined to be the threat or the risk, that is all going to play out in sort of the outcome of the threat assessment. It's not the school district's decision to get a child arrested or charged. Obviously, they can refer and make requests, but then it falls into the legal procedure chain of command. So the bottom line is that it is going to be up to local authorities overall to determine if there's questions of criminal or juvenile justice involvement.
Excellent, thank you. We have a question about SSES. Is that going to be a one-time benefit, or now with the new bill that passed, will it be an annual benefit for students?
Great question. So House Bill 1926 only changed the sunset provision on the legislation. So we already have a state law that talks about aspects of how a parent becomes eligible for the program and the benefit that they receive. The structure of the program itself did not change, only the fact that it was supposed to end and now it's not going to end. And that is obviously also contingent upon, of course, the legislature providing money, which is why I highlighted the budget rider that was adopted as part of House Bill 1, Budget Rider 73. So the bottom line is that parents will continue to participate the way they have. There were no sort of substantive changes to the program.
All right, excellent. We had some fantastic questions. In the interest of time, I'm going to go ahead and wrap everything up. If you still had a question that was not answered, please feel free to reach out to us. Stephen, any final thoughts as we're wrapping everything up today?
Yeah, well, I will just point out that, of course, this presentation is really about the regular session, which again ran from January to May. The 88th legislature is not finished. They're in special session now. They will likely return to special session later this year, maybe more than once. And so what ultimately affects public education and students with disabilities is still to some degree an open question, so stay tuned.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Stephen, for taking the time to join us and share this wealth of information. Really appreciate it. Thank you so very much for taking this time. As we're wrapping everything up today, let me stop sharing just for a moment and come back to our other slide deck. There we go. So I just want to thank you again for joining us today for our webinar on the review of the special education issues before the 88th Texas Legislature. Really appreciate you taking time to join us. And we really thank Disability Rights Texas and Stephen for giving us this information so that we can be informed. As a reminder, A recording of today's webinar will be available on our website at prntexas.org and also on our Facebook page. And if you're needing a certificate of attendance, you will receive an email to thank you for attending today's webinar. If you follow that link in the email, you can get your certificate of attendance. Be sure and check our website and Facebook page for information about webinars starting all over again in the fall. And then on the screen right now is contact information to reach out to us for our Director of Statewide Services, our support specialist, and myself. Also a link to our statewide webinar portion of our website and Facebook. Thank you again so much for joining us, and have a fantastic day. Stephen, as always, a pleasure to have you join us. Thank you so much for all the fantastic information. Really appreciate all the work you put into this and making sure we stay informed.
No problem. If I could ask a favor at some point, if you have any statistics about the attendees, like just numbers for my own benefit, and I can include that as my own sort of personal log for DRTX, I would appreciate that.
Yes, absolutely. I will email you those numbers later today.
Perfect. Thanks, you all.
Wonderful. Thank you so much.
Okay, bye-bye.